If you've seen The Social Network, Call Me By Your Name, or the most recent adaptation of Death on the Nile, you've seen Armie Hammer. January 20th, 2021, several of Armie Hammer's texts are anonymously posted to Instagram. These texts initially intimate that Hammer had a kinky interest in bondage. The general assumption was that it was all a stunt for publicity. But as more of these texts are posted, the BDSM nature of the text morphed into something less kinky and more torture. And there was even the implication of cannibalism. As more of these texts were posted, other women opened up about their experiences with the Blue Blood actor, eventually revealing the entire ordeal of the woman posting the original texts. It became rather obvious that these off-the-wall texts are just the tip of the iceberg, and it isn't just Armie who has an uneasy relationship with respectability. Move over, South Carolina. If you thought the Murdaws were the height of class aberration, you will soon have a new family to put in that role. For the next three episodes, we are covering the House of Hammer. My name is Kaylee, in case you want to know who's hosting this paragon of podcastiness. Hop along will get you in the right state of mind. I will see you on the other side.
He said she's not gonna help you. He said she's not. I just thought he looked like a powerful man. I just thought he looked like a powerful man.
Before I delve into this saga, I will remind you all that It's All Relative is a crime podcast. I am not into gore porn, but I also don't pull my punches, and I swear like a sailor. So please, please beware, all ye who continue listening from this point on. Also, although I do tend to believe the claims in this story, it should be said that the claims made about the Hammers have not been proven in the media or in a court of law. Therefore, the word alleged should be assumed at every interval. I am, however, not going to constantly say alleged because it's tedious and annoying. You will just have to deal. Armand Hammer was born in 1898 in the Bronx. His father, Julius, had emigrated from the Russian Empire, what is now Ukraine. Julius was a doctor and owned 5 drugstores. He was also a key progenitor of the CPUSA, that is, the Communist Party of the U.S., and he used his businesses to launder the party's money. Please note the time frame. Julius was wildly important in the Leninist takeover of Russia. The Russian Revolution, people. The Hammers were also Jewish by ethnic heritage, and the dyad of being Jewish revolutionary set off the government's "you are scary" censors, so they put Julius and his family under surveillance. For those of you who thought McCarthyism started in the 1950s, here's something to prove you wrong. Granted, it is called the Lust Committee at this point, but it is in the same vein as that championed by Senator McCarthy. Also, for those of you who don't know what McCarthyism is, I bow my head in the shame that is the American scholastic system. In this case, the government was probably right in their suspicion. Julius was so committed to Leninism that he sent his children to live with party members so that he could concentrate solely on making his pharmacies profitable so he could provide funds to the revolution. Armand was enamored of his father. Being sent away was difficult, so much so that upon his return to his family, he was actively professing Leninist rhetoric, especially Lenin's mantra that the ends justify the means. I think this would be the key to Armand's business success and the key to undermining the future generations of Hammers. Julius had big plans for his firstborn, and Armand was right there with him. He followed in his father's footsteps, enrolled in medical school, became a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, and dreamed of becoming Julius's partner when he was finished with his degree. As with most of these government ops, they couldn't get Julius on anti-American activities, but they were able to charge and convict him on an illegal abortion which allegedly resulted in the death of Marie Oganisov, on whom the abortion was performed. Now, before you go judging Julius or Marie, let me give you the main facts. Marie had a weak heart and a diseased physical condition, that is straight out of the appeal documents, by the way, which made pregnancy a very dangerous condition for her. She was 1 month into this pregnancy and terrified that continuing with it would cost her her life. Julius performed the abortion, purportedly with a crochet needle. He made sure that she was okay after the procedure and sent her on her way. Now, germ theory was in common usage by 1919, but it would be almost 10 years until penicillin would be discovered, let alone in common use. Marie developed sepsis and peritonitis and died 6 days later. Julius and Marie's husband both say she died from pneumonia. However, as the surveillance team had seen Marie go into Julius's practice on the 5th of July and come out hours later looking pale, they asked that an autopsy be performed. Julius goes on trial and is convicted. He is sentenced to 3 years in Sing Sing, which, let me be clear, is a horrible place to be in 1919. Also, there is the suggestion by one of Armand Hammer's biographers, Epstein, that it was Armand who performed the abortion, and Julius admitted to it to protect his son. Regardless, Julius goes to prison, and Armand and his younger brother Victor take over running the business. And believe me, it is circling the drain at this point. In 1921, Russia asks that Julius send a representative to Moscow. Julius, stuck in Sing Sing, decides to send Armand. At that time, to get a U.S. passport, you had to apply to the State Department, listing your entire itinerary. Allied, the name of the Hammer Corporation, sends a letter with Armand's application stating that he's going on a buying trip and intends to visit England, Norway, France, Holland, and Sweden. It sounds great. It's all a lie. The thing is, the State Department have to know it's all a lie. It's not like the Hammers weren't being surveilled. The U.S. government were trying to get Julius, in particular, for his communist activities. So why did they give Armand a passport? Because they did do just that. But when he lands in England, he is met by a member of Scotland Yard, who proceeds to question him about his plans, and specifically asks him about Russia. Armand's answer is that he may go to Russia to help with the famine relief, but the Yard is not convinced. They detain him for 2 days. Then they change their tune, for some unknown reason, and allow him to enter London. This, of course, only makes Armand more determined to reach Russia. He makes it, but he is horrified at the conditions there. He ends up spending most of a decade in Russia, making pencils. No, honestly, pencils. He meets a performer in a nightclub named Olga. He showers her with gifts and demands that she leave her husband. Olga agrees, and they become a couple. When Armand's brother Victor announces that he and his wife are going to have a child, Armand cannot be one-upped and insists that Olga become pregnant with his child. When Victor's son is born, Armand insists that the child be named after him. No, not the Victor him, the Armand him. Victor names his own son, not after himself, but after his brother, Armand. At this point, Armand's and Olga's relationship is a bit rocky, and she's rumored to have taken lovers. When she becomes pregnant, Armand is suspicious that the child is not his, and he would harbor this suspicion for much of the rest of his life, making his feelings known to his son Julian, also for the rest of his life, like every single day. Just think of the potential damage done to a child with a parent who does that. In his interview for Dossier, The Secret History of Armand Hammer by Edward J. Epstein, Julian said he loved his father and craved that love in return. He would do things his father liked to get his attention. He never got his father to show him any affection, and eventually the things Julian did became things his father hated. It's all very Freudian. The pencil making in Russia finally becomes tedious. The Great Depression rears its ugly head and starts spreading like a hydra in a guillotine. Not for the first time, the Hammer family fortune is taking a sharp downward turn. Almost 10 years after Armand entered Russia, it's time to return to the U.S. He is very tempted to leave Olga and Julian in Russia. His brother Victor ends up doing just that with his wife and son. Although in Victor's case, it's more due to the Iron Curtain crashing down on foreigners than how he felt about his family. Victor will not see his wife or son for 30 or more years because they are stuck behind the Iron Curtain. Armand will do his best to do the same, and his family will only be in upstate New York. Russia takes the pencil factory, but Armand, the king of bullshit, is able to convince the Russians not to leave all the Hammers bankrupt. He recognizes that the art that had once lined the walls of the homes of the Russian nobility was now just superfluous to the Soviets. The Bolsheviks had pulled all the accoutrements out of the manors and castles after the revolution. The Russian people were using the finest china as dinnerware and medieval woodcuts as shoe insulation. The Hammer brothers knew enough to know that they could buy these trappings for a song and then sell them to the wider Western world and to make a killing. So with the wolf baying at the proverbial door, Armand left Moscow with the intent of returning to the U.S. and running that end of the art dealing. Hammer did fairly well in art sales, but he wasn't going to let a little thing like the law stand between him and making a fortune. He also capitalized on the demand for alcohol in the middle of the Volstead Act, running bootleg spirits out to the masses. What Hammer thought had been a boon in Russia became an albatross in the U.S. to him. Olga was too Russian, prone to drinking too much vodka, speaking her mind, and playing with whatever pretty men she felt the need to play with. It made him rue the day he sent them secretly ahead to get them out of Russia. Armand met another performer named Angela Zevli. He was an old hand at playing the New York socialite. He divorced Olga November 29, 1943, and married Angela 3 weeks later. Olga got $75 a week, and Julian's school paid for. That's about $1,400 a week in new money. Unknown how much the school translates into. Armand and Angela spent the honeymoon in Cuba. Angela thought it was going to be an actual vacation, but Armand went there because he knew the resort owner, one Meyer Lansky, you know, the consigliere of the Genovese crime family, and he needed to do some wheeling and dealing. Armand knew that there was a hole in the market, and he was going to fill it. Alcohol manufacturers were limited during World War II in how much beverage alcohol they could make. The government needed industrial alcohol for munitions. Somehow, Armand was able to make beverage alcohol even though every other distillery in the U.S. was restricted in what they could produce. Years later, Armand's granddaughter, Casey, would say that her grandfather would secretly record people so that he would have blackmail material. I have to think that blackmail was involved in the lack of restrictions on Armand's alcohol manufacturing business. And if you look into the Hammer story, most of the chroniclers will tell you about the cough syrup that the Hammer pharmacies made. This cough syrup was very alcoholic, but because it was legally classified as medicine, it was legal alcohol in the midst of an alcohol drought. Needless to say, the Hammer pharmacies sold a shitload of this stuff and made mint. But the chroniclers do not seem to talk about the bootlegging. But the war was eventually over, and with it went the restrictions on producing alcohol for consumption. Armand tried to diversify by adding ammonia production to his manufacturing repertoire. But his connections to Russia, coupled with the surveillance by the feds, because yes, people, J. Edgar was still watching the Hammers, comes to bite him in the butt. The government contract he was relying on to make his business stay afloat was denied. And here's an important key to Armand Hammer. He believed in two highly connected concepts. One, if you want something done, go right to the top. And number two, you can generally get what you want if you just act like that's what's supposed to happen. So, Hammer has quite a few connections to very powerful people. Like I said, he went to Cuba because he knew Meyer Lansky. In this instance, Senator Bridges, who had been one of the backers of this government contract, decided that the best way for Hammer to overcome the allegations was for him, Armand, to sit down with the FBI mano a mano and clear everything up. The thing was, it worked. The FBI had no actual evidence of Hammer's activities, at least nothing legal. Today, Hoover is notorious for his less-than-kosher methods, but in the 1950s, he was loath to expose these methods to the light of day, which is what would happen if he disclosed the information the FBI had on Hammer's criminal activity. This reticence and the fact that most of the people involved from Hammer's time in Russia were all dead or unreachable also added to their inability to convict or even charge. Hammer skated away from any charges. He sold off the distillery in 1953 and threw the proceeds in a shell company. Oh, and did I mention that one of his supporters was none other than Joseph McCarthy? From Dossier, quote, what funds remained in his shell company were gradually siphoned off to pay Hammer's personal expenses. United Distillers had on its payroll his yacht captain, his airplane pilot, his Japanese chef, his personal lawyer, his chauffeur, his wife's maids, and even his farmhands. And it had on its books all the mortgages and loans he had taken out to pay for his yacht, plane, car, farm, and residences. It also was potentially liable for millions of dollars in lawsuits resulting from claims that Hammer's cattle breeding station had misrepresented defective bull semen it had sold. End quote. And yes, you heard that right. Defective bull semen. Hammer was so proud of his cattle. But yet another marriage was on the rocks. Angela had given Hammer the respectability of an American socialite in a time when his connections to Russia were coming into question. But they'd been living separate lives for years, and when they were together, her drinking made things rather uncomfortable indeed. Hammer told the world that he divorced Angela because of her alcoholism. The divorce paperwork reveals more of what was really going on. Again, from Dossier. Hammer had been so successful at managing his secret life that Angela knew nothing about Betty's presence in New York. But she had become increasingly agitated about her husband's refusal to share the accounting of their cattle sales and about the long periods when he was absent that summer. In July, she had asked him if there was another woman. He flatly denied it. Adultery was grounds for divorce in New Jersey, but he wanted the divorce on his terms, not hers. He told her the next day that he wanted a divorce because she was an alcoholic. He warned her not to oppose him. He told her that if she resisted the divorce, he would not hesitate to ruin her. Angela took the threat extremely seriously, as she explained in her deposition in the divorce proceedings, because she had learned during their 16 years together that my husband is a master of psychological warfare. His 9 years in Russia, at a time when that country was in a post-revolutionary state, replete with purges and liquidations, together with his medical training, causes him no pain to see the suffering of others. She also recalled that he would boast about the way he handled people in organizations who sought in any way to block him. But she didn't acquiesce to his wishes. She hated him too much. Hammer began systematically to dismantle Angela's life. End quote. From the House of Hammer documentary.
Unfortunately, she was an alcoholic, and after 10 years putting up with her, I divorced her.
Armie's wife, Angela, in her divorce testimony, she said that he willfully, maliciously, and deliberately pursued a course of conduct, employed techniques, tactics, and practices calculated and designed to destroy her will. He threatened her with serious bodily violence and injury, and to beat her brains out while brandishing a metal pipe. I feared my husband. He is a master of psychological warfare.
The extramarital affair spoken of is Betty. She was about 25 years younger than he and looked exactly like the girl he had lost to tuberculosis before he took up with Olga. He was instantly in love and took her everywhere. Then he used her to help him win his divorce from Angela. He had a neighbor bug Angela's home, mostly in the hopes of hearing what she said about him, worried that she may be able to offer him up to the feds. But he didn't listen to the tapes himself. He made Betty do it, and he had her transcribe the tapes, weeding out only what he deemed important to keep. Armand had promised to marry Betty, but the official end of his marriage with Angela came with a notice in the society pages. A very rich widow named Frances Tolman, they had met years previous, contacted him to see if she could help. Armand realized Frances's money could fix a lot of his problems and decided marrying Frances was the smart play. He shipped pregnant Betty off to Mexico and paid a local to sign fake divorce papers so that the child would be legit and their stay in Mexico not questioned. 10 years later, someone tries to blackmail Hammer over Betty and their daughter, Victoria. Betty tells him who she thinks the blackmailer is, a man named Howerton. From Dossier, quote, Hammer then met Betty at the airport there. He was wearing a wrinkled suit but looked in good shape for a man who was nearing 70. 2 men in sunglasses soon approached them, and Hammer told her that they worked for a federal drug agency, and with their help, he planned to set up Howerton by planting evidence against him. Even though the men did not display their badges, Betty did as Hammer asked and described Howerton to them. A few days later, her jewelry was returned to her, and when she asked Hammer what had happened to Howerton, he answered tersely, 3 guys went fishing and 2 came back. The blackmail threats ended. End quote. In 1955, Hammer got a call from Olga. He hadn't spoken to her in years. Presumably, he hadn't spoken to his son either. Olga was calling to tell him that Julian had been arrested for murder. Remember, when Hammer left Russia, he almost didn't bring Olga and Julian. He was ready to divorce himself from a connection to Russia, and that included his wife and son. In fact, he wasn't convinced that Julian was his son, and all but ignored him too. Eventually, Armand went so far as to have a paternity test done to hopefully, for Armand, prove Julian wasn't his once and for all. As a result, the adorable, happy, tow-headed boy, who Hammer's mother loved, by the way, became a sociopath who was hooked on drugs, sex, and violence. It is unclear what really happened to Bruce Whitlock, the man Julian killed, because the only witness, Julian's wife, could not be compelled to testify. What Julian told the court was that Whitlock had demanded money from Julian to pay off some of his, that being Whitlock's, gambling debts. Julian refused. Whitlock got aggressive, and Julian ended up shooting him in self-defense. The lawyer Armand Hammer got for Julian was able to make some brilliant argument, and Julian was never brought to trial. From the House of Hammer documentary,
bottom line, he could do whatever he wanted. He could get away with murder. And he did.
Armie Hammer's great-grandfather Julian was arrested for manslaughter in 1955. His old friend Bruce came to LA to celebrate his birthday and reminded him that Julian owed him $400, and then Julian shot him 2 times. This all happened when Sue was pregnant with Armie's father, Michael.
The story that he told us was self-defense. But my mom was very quick to tell me, no, your father just murdered someone in cold blood.
Armand Hammer got a phone call saying that his son had just shot someone. And so to save not his son, but to save his own reputation, he actually delivered $50,000 in cash to his lawyer, basically quashing the charges against his son, stopping his son from going to prison for murder.
And he didn't even seem like he was really bothered him that he shot his friend over the gambling debt. He talked to me just nonchalant about it.
You could get away with murder. You could do anything. There was no accountability.
Armand made it go away to save face, and then he goes on with his life like none of it ever happened. He then purchases a fertilizer company, initially to help the Soviets, but when Khrushchev takes control, his connection is squashed. So, he makes connections in Libya, gazumping the Seven Sisters cartel and finding more oil in his Libyan land parcel than was ever expected. When Nixon takes over for Kennedy, Hammer sees this as a positive. He worms his way into Nixon's good graces and ends up helping to launder money from Nixon's campaign, sending it back to Nixon as a contribution from himself. Then Watergate happens. The feds chose to go after Hammer for the campaign contribution. They pressured him into pleading on the money, a misdemeanor, or else they would try to get him on a conspirator role in Watergate. From Dossier. Hammer found it almost unbearably painful to admit his guilt before the world. About this period, he wrote in his autobiography, "Nothing in life meant more to me than my good name and reputation. And now, here I was about to be sentenced. I cannot describe the anguish I am suffering by being placed in this humiliating position," he wrote to his probation officer just before he was due to be sentenced. "It is as if a whole life of usefulness is being wiped out by the making of an anonymous political contribution of my own money, an act which was concedingly perfectly legal prior to April 7th, 1972. He then went on in this extraordinary 20-page letter to deny the very thing he was supposed to admit, his guilt. Williams, Hammer's lawyer, reviewed the letter aghast. It undercut the deal he had negotiated with the prosecutors, and he strongly advised Hammer not to send it. But Hammer could not resist trying once again to do what he had done so successfully in the past, manipulate information to his advantage. He overrode his lawyer and sent the letter to court. As Williams feared, Judge Jones found the letter to be inconsistent with the agreed-upon guilty plea. He ruled that if Hammer believed he was not guilty, he could plead not guilty. Stunning Hammer, he ordered the guilty plea withdrawn. The prosecution then announced that since the terms of the plea bargain had been violated, it would convene a grand jury to indict Hammer on 2 additional felony charges of obstruction of justice. Williams abruptly withdrew from the case. End quote. I love this part because it is one of the only times Hammer does not get what he wants. Oh, and the SEC takes this opportunity to go after him as well. Unfortunately for the feds and the SEC, Hammer plays the sick old man card. He does actually have quite a few health problems, but he never let those things stop him before, and now he was using them to get out of prosecution. And it works. The court takes pity on him and allows him to plead out to 3 misdemeanors. Weinstein seems to have taken a page out of Hammer's book in his recent court appearance in New York. Quote, "The long-delayed day of reckoning came on March 23, 1976. Hammer arrived in federal court in a wheelchair. His face, unusually tan, was ashen. His eyes were downcast. His body quivered. 2 doctors attached dozens of wires to him so that they could monitor his heart in an adjoining room. Attendants stood by with an oxygen tent and other emergency paraphernalia." End quote. And after this display, winning the pleas, Hammer lost tens of pounds quickly and then threw a party. Through all of this, Hammer is still trying to keep the art side of his empire afloat. Not just afloat. He wanted to be seen as someone with a keen eye and a ginormous collection. This is only fueled by his wife Frances's love of painting and her drive to copy all the great masters. Hammer, in his ego-fueled haze, thinks his personal collection is the cat's meow. It is actually more the cat's used litter box, but no one is going to tell him this. His art advisor actually resigns rather than brave telling Hammer the complete truth to his face. Quote, "During the next few years, Hammer hired a number of top people to run it, including John Richardson, who had previously headed Christie's fine art department. Richardson remembers Hammer as a wizened old man who, with his leathery skin and hooded eyes, reminded him of an old tortoise. He was impressed by Hammer's energy, but realized that he had no eye for art and no scruples. This became evident when Hammer took him to his home and showed him a painting that he claimed was Modigliani's Woman of the People. Richardson recognized the work as a howling fake, but, guessing that he was being set up, tactfully said, 'Interesting.' Sidebar, people. I'm from Minnesota, and in Minnesota the term 'interesting' can have several meanings. The tactful usage, as was used by Richardson, means you are a ridiculous fool for believing this crap is real, but okay, I'll humor you. Or, so I choose to believe, because I don't think Richardson was from Minnesota. But the scene is playing out so beautifully in my head, I'm giving him honorary Minnesotan status. Okay, back to the citation. Hammer chose to take Richardson's laconic comment as a sign that he believed the painting was genuine and exclaimed with great glee, "That painting fools all you experts. It's a copy by Frances." Richardson also noticed that Hammer's putative Rembrandt engraving of the goddess Juno had Frances's face in place of Juno's. End quote. By the time Richardson left, Hammer already had another art consultant in mind. In 1974, Hammer had been interviewed about his collection by a freelance writer on a job for an airline magazine. He was taken with her immediately. By September 1974, Martha Kaufman was in charge of the Hammer Museum and also his mistress. In return for his covering all her living expenses and her role at the museum, she was to be available to him in a moment's notice, no matter where in the world he was. Supposedly, Frances did not suspect Martha's real role in Hammer's life until the early 1980s, when Frances ordered Hammer to get rid of Martha. Hammer had Martha's name legally changed to Hilary Gibson and made her wear a wig and glasses to complete the charade. Again, Frances was supposedly blind to the subterfuge. By the time Hammer turned 90 in 1988, he had set his sights on the Nobel Peace Prize. His response to detractors was, "If necessary, I will make my own categories." Armand Hammer died on December 10th, 1990. And that is the progenitor of the Hammers. I apologize if you feel that you have a word salad tossing in your head. But who the proverbial founding father is of the House of Hammer was key to understanding what the House of Hammer is. Trust me, I left a lot out. When next we meet, we will talk about the subsequent generations. Julian the son, Michael the grandson, and Casey the granddaughter. If you like the show and want to give your support, please like, rate, review, and subscribe. Don't forget to tell your friends. If you'd like to donate financially, the Patreon is linked in the show notes. In fact, you can search It's All Relative on Patreon right now. Contact details are also in the show notes for case suggestions and constructive comments. JME will sing you out, and I will talk at you next time on It's All Relative.
Oh my God, I'm so dumb. What am I thinking? With my powers, I should be stopping all the poverty in Africa and all them things. Wait, but the media will speculate, then feds will interrogate, MI5 will investigate. That's just too debate.
Blood, that's feds following us.
Huh? Wait, I cloned Westwood's car, it's got the same registration plate, man. This is peak.
You've got nothing, you've got nothing. You want something, so you need power. Don't abuse your power. Don't abuse your power. Don't abuse your power.
Think. What can I do?